You're currently publishing your autobiography of sorts on the net. Why are you doing that?
I chose to write my life story on the internet for free because I felt that I didn't want any restriction. I didn't want anyone editing me. I didn't want anyone telling me that something I thought was important wasn't important, because I think life is a series of really mundane details with occasional explosions of actual significance. And I think in order to tell the story as I've perceived it and I've experienced it, I need to go into the level of detail that I want to go into.
When you hear the name Billy Corgan, what comes to your head? More than likely, it's 90s hits from the legendary Smashing Pumpkins. Whether it be their early work when he was a mop-headed hipster singing grungy anthems of adolescent love and anger, screaming about being a rat in a cage, or it's their latter output of the decade, where the bald-headed band leader was wrapped in latex clothes and sang alt-rock anthems with a goth-rock edge, attempting to continue the legacy of one of the 90s most important bands. Smashing Pumpkins is huge, and they're responsible for not one, not two, not three, but at least 8 iconic songs from the decade. The Smashing Pumpkins were a force to be reckoned with, and did a lot to not only make alt-rock and grunge a staple in music, but to innovate and experiment in ways that can still be heard in music today. So a band as esteemed and legendary as the Smashing Pumpkins needs no real introduction at this point. And I would say the same thing about Billy, but the interesting thing about him is that as high profile as he was, he's done a lot of other work throughout the decade and even beyond that tends to be overlooked and outright forgotten about. For example, the man wasn't just a one-band pony. He had his fingers in many pies throughout the music scene, such as producing one of the most beloved records of the 90s, Marilyn Manson's Mechanical Animals, even being featured as a guest vocalist on one of the songs. He would also do a lot of co-writing for one of the 90s most hated bands, Hole, working on their album Celebrity Skin. And if that wasn't enough, he would even somehow work with Lenny Kravitz, and that's just some of the features here. His list goes much further, and he even did some soundtracking on top of it. Needless to say, Billy was a busy boy during the decade. But as most people know, come the turn of the millennium, the Smashing Pumpkins, and really Billy, would cease to exist from the mainstream. That's mostly due to the fact that Smashing Pumpkins would break up after a very tumultuous and strained career, with their members dropping in and out constantly, drug addictions running rampant, and butting heads and feuding egos, leading to the group deciding to finally set it all aside and do 2 final records before calling it quits. In 2000, after the Machinist series would see release, the band would cease to exist, and as popular history remembers it, Billy would form a new band after that would go essentially nowhere, before fading into obscurity, before jumping right back out into the mainstream in 2006, bringing the Pumpkins back to life, and putting out an underrated and overshit on record called Zeitgeist. This recollection of history is for the most part correct, but it does overlook one important piece of the puzzle. And that was the period of time between Zwan and Zeitgeist, where Billy would produce one project that has gone relatively forgotten in the 2 decades since its release. And that project would be the beautiful and somber record, TheFutureEmbrace. What if I told you that in 2005, Billy Corgan would release an experimental solo record with a star-studded cast of features, including the likes of Robert Smith of The Cure, Emily Autumn, Bon Harris of Nights Arab, and previous bandmate Jimmy Chamberlain, just to name a few. TheFutureEmbrace would be the 2005 solo effort that Billy Corgan would put out, that would encompass this star-studded, prestigious guest list. So how does a project this big with this many big names behind it go into obscurity so fast? Well, there's some mixed reception. The music just wasn't for everyone. And critics, and even fans alike, didn't know how to feel about it. But hey, just because some lame critics shit on a record, and alt-rock fans didn't really accept something that was outside of their wheelhouse, doesn't mean that this gem of an album wasn't amazing. So hey, why don't we just take a step back into the 2000s, and let's dig up a diamond of Billy Corgan's past. Let's talk about the hidden gem, the future embrace. Now, before we get into the music proper, I think it's important we take a trip through memory lane to really understand the era this all happened in. Because despite how it may seem today, the 90s wave of artists didn't really have much of a smooth transition into the 2000s. Post Y2K, much of the 90s music scene would begin to fall off and die, with many of its staple artists either falling out of the mainstream or straight up taking hiatuses and breaking up. Smashing Pumpkins would obviously close up shop and break up after the Machina records, but many of the other big acts would go through similar issues. Nine Inch Nails would enjoy the spoils of success that came with their 1999 record The Fragile, but soon in the middle of the Fragility 2.0 tour in 2000, Trent Reznor would end up suffering an overdose, and the band would go quiet until 2005 when Wind Teeth dropped. Marilyn Manson, on the other hand, would be able to coast the first few years of the 2000s, at least until he released his record, The Golden Age of Grotesque, a record that I might personally like, but in the end would split his fan base before he himself would also decide to try and opt out of the music scene by putting out a greatest hits record and hoping to end his career there. Although, as time shows, this didn't actually happen, but regardless, it did cause his star to fall, if not completely, just enough to pull him out of the mainstream. And these are just two titans. We can talk about the plethora of huge grunge bands from the early half of the 90s that by this point had either broken up or have simply fallen out of favor with the mainstream audiences. And on the other half of the decade, we have the nu metal wave, which famously took the world by storm during the late 90s, which come the early to mid 2000s had really began to dissipate. Aside from bands like Linkin Park and maybe Evanescence, the majority of these bands would see themselves become hated, with Limp Bizkit quickly shifting from being seen as legends to a bunch of hated hacks, and Korn coasting during the first few years of the 2000s, going through a really big lineup change when Head left the band, which would end up affecting their popularity and cultural vice grip, especially as most of the records they produced without him would be seen as lesser and given much less fanfare. I mean, hell, even fucking Metallica would fall apart during the early 2000s, putting out Saint Anger, which I don't really think I need to get into. The record and its overall impact is infamous enough. I bring all this up to really beat the point into the ground that much of what worked in the 90s and the icons of the era in rock and metal were quickly falling off with the new millennium. And the big actor here was that they were being replaced. There was a lot of new underground scenes that had begun to grow into their own big deals. The 2000s mall goth wave that would see genres like pop punk and post-hardcore dominate airwaves and become the new staple, kicking off the emo wave that we all know it as today. And on the other side of the alt spectrum with the goths, you had things like agrotech and darkwave beginning to rise up in popularity. Bands like The Birthday Massacre and Voltaire would start to dominate the scene, And this was also coming around the same time that the initial wave of the indie rock boom would get its start. While we wouldn't see that take its cultural dominance until the latter half of the decade, this was where it began to seed. Now, I bring all this up not just to overload you with a ton of information, but to really give an idea of just how unfriendly and outwardly hostile the new millennium was to many of the staples of the 90s, and just how much the commercial and underground music scenes were really changing during this time. So when it came time for Billy to try his first attempt at a new project, well, it went about as well as you might have thought it would.
I've said not once, but many times.
Hey, what's happening, and welcome to another episode of The New Music. My name is George. It is good to be with you. We've got Daniel Lanois, The Burning Brides, and we go back in the day with the Queen. Not the Queen you're thinking about, but a different one. We'll start with this one here. It was no doubt in anybody's mind that Billy Corgan was the Smashing Pumpkins. He was the frontman, he was the songwriter, he was all of that.
Our basic ideology is to attack the mainstream from within.
Don't ask any questions about Courtney Love, Jimmy Chamberlain, or Marilyn Manson.
Is it dumb enough? We like to shake the hands of the politicians before we shoot them between the eyes. Is it loud enough? Do we care? The revolution I want to lead is probably something more arty and something a little more esoteric. But, you know, getting the girls to love you and the boys to want to be you, I mean, that's for a young man.
So when he decided to break the band up in 2000, it wouldn't have been a surprise to anybody if he carried on using that name. But he didn't. Instead, what he did was spend some time in New Order. Then he reformed with Jimmy Chamberlain, the Pumpkins drummer, got some indie rock giants, and put together a supergroup called Zwan. I hooked up with Billy and the new crew when they passed through Toronto.
Come 2001, Billy would team up with former bandmate Jimmy Chamberlain and would start a new project from the ashes of the Pumpkins. A supergroup titled Zwan, spelled with a Z for extra hipster points. It would include members from A Perfect Circle and Slint. The group would quickly come together to create their first and only record, Mary Star of the Sea, which is yet another hidden record, though I wouldn't really call this one a gem. And, well, I guess to clarify, we have to ask the question, how does a group of musicians as prestigious as this get memory hold so fast? It's easy to see why this project was so short-lived. While the band was far from being bad, it was underwhelming at best. And more so, it was just a watered-down sound from a group of musicians whose collective efforts over the years and prior bands had produced some of the most iconic and important records for their time. There's a reason you don't really ever hear Zwan being brought up in conversations about underloved music, because they were mostly coasting off of their previous fame for their other bands. Now, despite this, their album would end up getting some pretty high critical acclaim, but it wouldn't splash in the mainstream as they probably hoped for. So that, along with a very messy and unflattering relationship as a band, and the whole project would quickly fall apart in less than 2 years. The music wasn't the big problem, it was more of their attitude. Why do we have to practice? I'd rather be hanging out at the Rainbow, lifestyle stuff. And then you get into the whole, what I would call, cataclysmic behavioral stuff. Sex acts between band members in public, people carrying drugs across borders, Pahos sleeping with the producer's girlfriend when we were making the record. I just tried to do what I've always done, which is to patch it up and roll it out. You go into a denial state. I got snookered in by really bad people. It's embarrassing to me, but it wised me up to why I play and who I love, and made me appreciate my old band even more. Billy would go on to state in other interviews that beyond just the general dysfunction, there was also a deep-seated distrust of each other. So just as quick as it all had started, it would come crashing and burning and ending. with Zwan's calling it quits and Billy moving on to his next project. And while Zwan was a short-lived and probably bitter experience for him, the reason I'm bringing it up here is because of a few reasons. One, it's just kind of funny, and two, it's one of the main reasons why his next project would actually end up being so interesting.
I think with most albums I make, I just try to take a snapshot of wherever my head's at a given time. A lot's been made of the fact that it's a solo album, and of course it is my first solo album, but I didn't really think like that. It didn't change the way I work. I always just try to write for the situation I'm in. I decided not to make a sort of typical rock album because that sound is pretty much in my eyes the sound of the Pumpkins. And I like doing that kind of music, but I just felt that for the identity of the kind of music I wanted to create for this, I needed to do something that's a little different. The two main themes of The Future Embrace seem to be this sort of the ending of this long relationship, not necessarily talking about the ending of the relationship, but sort of like where it's left me in my life. At the time I was 37, I'm 38 now, so I have no family, and I've so committed my life to my artistic pursuits that I'm not bitter about that, but it's left me in a lot of strange positions.
The failure of the Zwan project is incredibly important because it would be the initial catalyst for Billy Corgan to start experimenting beyond his tried and true strengths. Originally intending on producing a record about Chicago's history, he promptly realized how fucking boring of an idea that was and opted to instead begin work on what would become his first solo record, TheFutureEmbrace. The album is not just a departure, but an outright rejection of Billy's previous output, bringing in an entirely new sound that he had never really played with before and fuses it with a mixture of at the time contemporary house music and a lot of My Bloody Valentine style production with shoegaze guitars, things that aren't really super heavy but are still incredibly noisy. In an interview, he would actually have this to say about the record. I chose not to use the conventional drums, bass, big guitar sound, both because I'm so identified with it and I felt that there's some sort of corner there that I didn't want to paint myself in, plus it reminds people of the Pumpkins, and I think for a solo record, having your solo work be reminiscent of your past work, particularly with a band you're known for, gets into a trickiness because it makes people sentimental for the old band and makes them hate you because you're not in the band. While statements like this are a bit of a dime a dozen when it comes to solo records, the album here actually plays directly into this sentiment. While there are plenty of guitars and bass to be found on this thing, it doesn't sound anything like the grunge alt-rock or even the type of shoegazy stuff that was being used beforehand in his previous material. Rather, it's a weird fusion of all of these sounds with that 2000 synth experimentation that a lot of people were messing with during the early half of the decade. But as ballsy as that might be to do for the whole record, Billy does try to lighten the load with the opener. The first track on the album is called All Things Change, and while it is an overall tone and sound shift from his previous work, it still has some reminiscent tones to it. This is probably the closest you're going to get to a Smashing Pumpkins sound on the record. And even then, it's pretty far off, but what is here is fantastic, and when the first time listening to this album back when I was in high school, it actually got me really excited to dig more into this thing, because as much as I did like the Pumpkins, I always wanted to hear Billy try different things with his voice and try to use his guitar playing in different contexts. And that is on full display here. And, funny enough, that was the point of this song. This was the 0 point for the record. We'd been messing around for a couple of months, but All Things Change was the first time we found the feeling we were going for musically. I knew I wanted to sing something at the end, and the words "we can change the world" came into my head when I was driving around. I thought, oh man, you're asking for it. But there's something so car crashy about someone actually saying something like that. You don't want to look, but you have to. The feeling is authentic. I do feel like we can change the world, but it's not a Michael Jackson sense. There's a sense here that it's not going to be easy. As good of an opener as this track is, and it does do a good job of really explaining to the listener through its music just what they're getting into, I do think that it's trumped pretty instantly by the following track, Mina Loy. Mina Loy really goes out of its way to give you the full spectrum of what you're going to be hearing. Because outside of some lead parts and some softer songs on the album, the guitars sound like buzzing bees covered in as many flanger and chorus pedals that Billy could fit on his pedal board. And the main instrument that you're going to be hearing for the majority of the album is the distorted and wailing synthesizers as well as the pounding drum machines. And while that's kind of par for the course for a lot of records, especially during the mid-2000s, what sets it all apart with TheFutureEmbrace is that instead of it being a straight-up electronic album, there's an effort to really make it all feel organic. Part machine, part human. And while it doesn't always succeed in hitting that perfect medium, when it does, it really makes this thing feel special. There's nothing else like this album. I know I previously said that, and I'm probably going to say it again, but it's just the truth. There's something really haunting and strange about the melodies and the overall sound palette that can be found here. And honestly, that's mostly because of the previously mentioned guest list that appears on this album. Most of the synthesizers and drum machines that you're hearing are being performed by Jimmy Chamberlin and, more importantly, sorry Jimmy, Bon Harris. If you don't know who Bon Harris is, he is from the band Nitzer Ebb, one of the most important and underrated bands from the 80s and 90s who helped to really make EBM the genre that it was. And his contributions to TheFutureEmbrace, at least in my opinion, are the real reason that this record shines so bright. And Mina Loy is a great representation of this. It's a song that doesn't go full bore with the noisy guitars, but it does incorporate many of the elements that the record uses to define itself. Having this striking, almost dark wave tone to it, all while Billy's unique vocal style transforms the whole thing into its own unique blend. He doesn't try to emulate goth vocalists or even try to scream like a lot of the old EBM artists did either. Instead, Billy just kind of does his thing. He croons, he whines, and he sings the way you would expect him to, but with a different context of the sound and the different tone of even the lyrics, it shifts the entire record into something truly special. The next song on the album continues this experimentation. It's a track called The Camera Eye. But unlike the previous two tracks, which do remain to a certain degree upbeat, this is where Billy begins to really turn the tides of the album, and bring in more of the bleak and somber direction musically that this album is famous for. It's where the anger really starts to reveal itself, and the harsher elements become a bit more cohesive. This is like one of those poems where you vaguely know what it's about, but can't quite explain it. It has something to do with this feeling that love is constantly being perverted. You're constantly asking yourself what true love really is. I've been with women, and I thought I found my true love, and it's turned out to be the worst, most hurtful thing. You think, is that true love? I've been with women who are completely devoted and would lie across a railroad track for me, and I think this is kind of boring. So what is true love anyway? Somehow the words and the images in The Camera Eye communicate that to me. This quote really kind of gets into the weeds of the lyrical side of the album. One of the big elements of the TheFutureEmbrace that makes it really feel the way that it does is that underneath all the experimentation, all the distortion, when we break this record down, at the heart of it, it's a love letter to Robert Smith's work. Billy has never stated that The Cure is the inspiration behind this record, but much of the instrumentation and guitar work, as well as the overall feel of the lyrics, it's all just really reminiscent of The Cure's 80s output. And again, I can't emphasize how much it is lyrically like the 80s Cure records. I mean, hell, if we go back one track before to Mina Loy, it's right there in the open. It's plain the wars have won. The days of judgment rise. For innocents, wounded souls, how could they know? They're burning cold. Paranoias be they may, I resolve to never change. Can I give my old heart to you? The mixture of lovesickness, heartbreak, and real-world fears and issues, all coming together to paint an homage to Robert Smith's signature lyrical style. And before you think that this is just me projecting my own fanboyisms here, this is all but confirmed with the next track on the album, To Love Somebody. Robert Smith appears to lend his twinkly guitars and his beautiful voice on a cover of an old Bee Gees song that, in its current form here, is essentially unrecognizable. The whole song is a shoegazy track backed by a distorted drum machine where Billy croons along with Robert to create this distinctly cold and somber masterpiece of a rendition. It's probably my favorite track off the album, but that is a given because, as I said before, I simp for The Cure. Though I think even on its own merits, it sits above the rest of the record for having the most palpable and powerful atmosphere of any of the other songs on the album. Though as much as Robert Smith looms over this entire record with his influence, he's not the only songwriter that gets his flowers from Billy here. As one of the later tracks on the album is titled Pretty Pretty Star, and if that name didn't give it away, it's an entire celebration of David Bowie. Yes, this is the most Bowie-esque title imaginable, and that's the point. It was my way of winking and saying that I know what's going on here, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not going there. I know David halfway decently, and I've always been open about my love for his work. Then having played with Mike Garrison, who was the Aladdin Sane pianist, and all that stuff, my heart is close to that feeling. It might be a bit obtuse of a track on the initial listen, but if you're familiar with Bowie's work, it's extremely noticeable just how much Billy's pulling from him here. From the vocal melodies themselves to the lyrics, the guitar playing, it's all in line with Bowie's signature style, just mangled and distorted into the weird genre-defying sound that the TheFutureEmbrace really goes for. And even for as unconventional of a song as it may be, funny enough, it's my second favorite off the record, and one of my favorite songs across all of Billy's projects, including the Pumpkins. It's both a great experimental piece, as well as a fun exploration of the main influences behind Billy's work. The album definitely isn't for everyone, but if you are a fan of his work and you're a fan of his influences especially, the album perfectly embodies the idea of a hidden gem. It's a record that's become obscure and forgotten over time, but within it lies a bunch of amazing songs, and the whole thing comes together to live as a time capsule for the weird types of experimental records that you would find all over the 2000s. I mean, you even get a collaborative track featuring Emily Autumn on this thing, which is probably the most 2005-ass baby bat shit you could find. While today the name Emily Autumn might be a bit of a deep cut, back in the early 2000s, she was a big deal and carved out her own little niche in the goth scene at the time. Though, like many from the scene at the time, her star ended up fading as the years would go on and would become overshadowed by much better artists of that time, like Voltaire. Now, the last song I really want to talk about is another one of my personal favorites. It comes off the back end of this album, and it's the track known as Sorrows in Blue. The song is a somber and beautiful take on the unique shoegaze sound that this entire record has been steeped in, with lush yet harsh guitars and yearning vocals, singing longing lyrics of melancholy. And according to Billy himself, this is the song that he felt captured his vision for the record. Now that's a weird one. Besides All Things Change, I think this song captures what I was trying to say emotionally and sonically with the album. But it's a strange song, and I don't even know what I'm trying to say exactly. It's definitely a feeling-based song, and not at all intellectualized. Now, all my glazing aside for this record, there is a reason why it's in the Hidden Gems series. And that's because for as fantastic as it is, it was a flop. It was an album that was met with little to no reception, and critics typically panning it. And while most of us probably don't give a shit what some stupid critic has to say, at this point in his career, Billy was desperate to keep his star shining, and as his popularity was fading and his newer projects were flopping, it would lead for him to desperately grasp at straws and toss this project aside, leaving it all to rot in the abyss. Upon release, Billy would pull together a band to tour around and support the album, even getting a number of TV spots on late night shows to promote the entire thing. Though ultimately, this solo venture would be very short-lived, and even more so than Zwan was. Come 2006, Billy would end up making a very drastic decision that would change the future forever. And that decision was to bring back the Smashing Pumpkins, but with a completely different lineup. Whether this was his desperate attempt at trying to regain the relevance he once had, or a genuine emotional moment that came across him that he felt he needed to embark on, regardless, TheFutureEmbrace would be tossed to the side and quickly fade into obscurity, as he wouldn't really mention it or play around with it ever again. This new lineup of the Pumpkins would quickly come together, and they would start touring around playing classic material at live shows before putting out a record of their own. As I stated at the beginning of the video, this would be a record known as Zeitgeist. A record that as soon as it was announced, all the interest in any of Billy's previous work disappeared. It was all Pumpkins once again, with Zwan and TheFutureEmbrace both fading away fully, as everyone was ready to either absolutely defend like it's their unborn child, or absolutely flog and crucify this new iteration of the Pumpkins. But I guess that just goes to show the hard truth about certain people. As popular of a figure as Billy Corgan was, and well, still is, he will always be tied to the Smashing Pumpkins. Without that name behind him, the mainstream has always more or less turned their heads at him. And it's honestly a shame, because much of his other projects, and especially his ventures into solo work, as strange as they can be at times, are all fantastic in their own right. Even that Zwan record I threw off at the very beginning, it's not that bad. It's not my cup of tea, but it is a pretty competent record, and again, doesn't really deserve to be fully forgotten. And as I've probably made clear with this video, TheFutureEmbrace desperately deserves some attention to it, as it's a fantastic piece of art that's both criminally underrated and does not deserve to be forgotten the way it has been. But then again, I guess that is the nature of the beast. Once you're known for one thing, it's pretty hard to shift people's attention and perspective to something else. And TheFutureEmbrace is just another victim of that phenomena. But hey, I guess that's what makes it a hidden gem. Now, before we all go, there's one last thing I want to show you. This is my wall of shame. The list of names of the people who financially support me and keep me chained to this keyboard, cranking out scripts like there's no tomorrow. All jokes aside, I can't thank them enough for their support. And without them, I really wouldn't be able to keep doing this, as this pays for all the equipment I need to do this channel. So, if you'd like to jump on and you'd like to help me become full-time in the near future, consider joining my Patreon or giving me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. You'll get your name in the credits here, and I will think you're a pretty cool person. But with all that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you all in the next video.